Good morning, traders, and a happy Wednesday out there to everyone. Hope that y'all had a nice evening there for starters last night and are ready for this day in front of us here. Just before we go diving into the charts, a few things to be aware of here today on the calendar. We have our FOMC member Barkin there set to speak at 8:30 Eastern Time. And then outside of that, we'll have our JOLTS and manufacturing PMI for the US due out at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. That was a little bit more substantial there, so we'll want to make note of that. And then lastly, we have our FOMC meeting minutes, just the meeting minutes there at 2 o'clock p.m. respectively. So a couple of things to keep in mind there that we'll have in the queue for today's action. But with that said, we'll come over here and start to jump into our daily charts for the S&Ps. Of course, we know yesterday we had left ourselves a bit of a tail there on the daily chart, closing up off of our lows. However, in the overnight session, we've been working on trading into the tail area with 65.50 being the previous day's low, and our Globex low being 47.65.50. So nice, perfect test of our previous day's low. And what we'll want to keep an eye on is, seeing how we handle the testing phase. So far, we've come down and have just given it mild tests so far. But if we end up, taking that out with, decent momentum, our next zone kind of down below from there is going to be the bottom of that bar from the 20th, the 47.43 and change, which also ties in fairly close with where our daily EMA comes into sight there for our S&Ps. Coming down to the intraday data from yesterday's action, right? It gives us the feeling this was our settlement yesterday, so we closed up off the lows. And then in the overnight session, like we said, we came down and kind of gave them a double test or a double bottom, so no major breach of the low, but they certainly gave it a solid test. So we'll keep an eye, see how they want to play around that zone, if at all. And then as we come down to, the slightly lighter time frames, we can see it's more of just a simple test as opposed to being like a major divergence or anything along those lines, just because we came down and made the perfect retest. So not really giving us much of that feeling as of yet, but gives us a zone to rotate around 47.65 of 50. Once again, if we breach that, then we'd be coming down to the lower end of that bar from the 20th. On the flip side of the coin, should we have any type of, counter-reactive lift back up, we'll have that 47.96.75 that served us yesterday as kind of being a hurdle up above. So some nice zones, if you would, for these S&Ps to keep an eye on here for our session here today. But for now, we'll want to just keep an eye and watch them, be respectful of the fact that they're trading around the low from yesterday. But as we can see on the 5-minute data, I mean, we had a pretty good selling pressure there during the Europe session, so they're working on just a little counter-reactive lift. So they tested PD low and are trying to do some short-term defending of it just for now, but nothing saying that we can't come back and revisit that zone at some stage here today. And then moving on along, we have our DAX future next in the queue. It certainly had quite the range yesterday. We just didn't necessarily close on the highs nor the lows. We ended up closing in the middle of the range, but nice to see them opening up with a little more definition here in the early morning session. All right, so we came in. There was a little bit of an odd reaction that we had. We came up, failed to make the full high, but on the same token, we came down and just tested the 16,795. So we didn't really breach outside the range in the DAX until the overnight Globex session here, just beneath the previous day's low. The previous day's low, the 16,795. So in the case of the DAX, we've already kind of came down and traded to the daily EMA, so that's already out of the way for that of the DAX. And then coming down to the intraday data, I wouldn't say it's exactly the same as our ES, just because we did make a better lower low, if you would. But for the early morning session, what we'd just be keeping an eye on is something like our 15-minute data here for the DAX. We'd want to mark off that overnight low, the Globex low that we had put in. And for now, it just seems like they're working off a little of this buy divergence type of feeling on the 15-minute chart. But even if we have any of that feeling, this 16, 795 still going to be a point of interest there, or hurdle in the case of our DAX future. So not too bad though. As you can see, it's not too far off the spread between where we're trading currently and the previous day's lows. Not too large there, so we'll keep an eye, see if that ends up being a little hurdle or resistance on the first try up there in the case of the DAX. And then we have our euro currency really starting to open up in its range here. Pretty stout selling pressure that we had yesterday during the overnight session, though. We recall that the U.S. morning was left with consolidation, so we have proceeded to get a high degree of follow through from the overnight session. Also important to note the fact that we're back below 1.1 even, just as a bit of a round figure there in that of the euro currency. So we also have sliced through the daily EMA, and we're starting to come back down towards the bottom of this previous wide bar overlap area that we had before, from the sharp up and sharp down, and then proceeding to fill out range for a couple days. So we've given most of that back here in the euro currency now, and we'll start to see just a notch more detail here on the intraday data. Right, so on this 120-minute display, for one, we're beneath 1.097, right? Previous cycle low from yesterday's trading, so valid data point that we're now doing some work beneath. And any further down from here in the euro currency, what we'd be running into are these two previous cycles that we had right around 1.09315. So in case the euro currency doesn't get any counter-reactive lift, that's going to be our next zone or point of interest there as far as the euro currency goes. So really opening up in its range, pretty well here with these past two daily bars that we've been putting in there. So, and just at a quick glance here, we won't get too far on it here. Is that a dollar index, right? Dollar index basically going inverse that of the euro currency. So as we see some pausing action, if you would, EC, the Canadian dollar, and the Aussie, it's setting the stage for a little better relief lift here in that of the dollar index. In note, 102.010, a previous cycle that we had here in the case of the dollar index. So doing a little bit of work back above that point there with the help from some weakness there in our euro currency. So that is that. Next in the queue is the gold. The gold, very interesting because we did have a good test yesterday, right? We had breached and put in that lower low on the hourly charts, but they came down and kind of gave us more of the test reject feeling. We didn't spend a whole lot of time near those lows in the gold, so we ended up closing briefly up off the lows right in front of the previous day's low. But now in the overnight session, we picked up much better steam. This is kind of where we were left with on the gold. This was our testing phase that we had yesterday when we left the tail beneath our 2069 mark there. So we came down, left the tail, and then proceeded to close back up above it. However, when we came down and breached it for the second time, the yellow line, we did start to pick up a little better selling activity, or picking up better range expansion. So when we are working our way down in the gold, we can jump out just a time frame higher, and this is going to be one that's going to show up nice on the market profile line of view, simply because as we come down here, it's not going to show up as one particular zone here on the bar charts. But if we were to come in here, I could make this a little bit more bold, and essentially just kind of consider the fact of drawing a line through these points where we had put in a lot of work, a lot of sideways trading through that area, lower end of this previous range. We had put in a lot of work there as well. So around this kind of 2045, 2046 mark as being kind of just a bit of a congestion zone or quasi volume node of sort in the gold. But once again, that's going to be one that's going to show up nice on the market profile line of work, simply just from having all this work that we have done in the past. So it's coming down in a pretty constructive format, slowly but surely. We're already on the other side of the daily EMA, so just mentioning the fact that if we come down any further, you can kind of see that on the daily chart as well, the fact that we had a lot of price bar overlap throughout all these areas there for the gold. So I don't need to expand too much further on that, but that's just kind of the general idea there between those hourly and 120-minute time frames there for that of the gold. Alright, so Got that one moving and grooving, and now we have this crude here as well. Crude kind of interesting because the crude had some play in the overnight session as well, right? Pretty active. Right, so we already had 4 days of red bars down, or 4 days of high to low. So we were left yesterday evening on the close with a little hint of loss of momentum or buy divergences starting to form on the hourly chart. So we came down, put in a much lower low. For one, we breached the 70 even mark, right? So we traded down to 69.28 in that of the crude. So a pretty deep response. However, I mean, we obviously held the full retest down, so we traded to this inside area on the dailies, but did an okay job of maintaining themselves. Over on the hourly display, though, once again, like you said, you kind of had a little feeling of a little hint of value divergence or a loss of momentum, but that's all playing out overnight whilst we were still sleeping. So we had a nice counter-reactive lift. We already reverted well above the hourly moving average, and essentially just have been kind of running into this 71 and a quarter, which was our previous low prior to our action that we had yesterday, right? So our Friday low, if you would, there in the crude. So we'll keep an eye on, just because we already have had counter-reactive lift. Should we push back down at all or consolidate back to the downside, we'll really want to watch that 70 even mark there. See if they're able to, hold that, perhaps put in a feeling of a higher low to take place there in the crude. But so far we have a pretty good, selling pressure, right? We had 4 to 5 days down, and so far just a pause bar of green with a good portion of that happening in the overnight session. So we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves with the crude. It has had damage that was done, and you've already had some counter-reactive lift. So if we come back and perhaps roll back over, put in some type of higher low, that could be a little bit more of a constructive view for the crude. But so far not bad. They're holding their own, doing their work there. And then last but not least here, that of the bonds here, which we'll jump out here on the 120-minute display. As far as the dailies go, we had our little balancing act. We didn't really set the world on fire there yesterday, but we did have, a decent extension bar. We had just left a tail, so almost like the E-minis, the fact that we were working on eating into the tail overnight. So the bonds, the 30s, came in and put in a lower low, right? Took out previous day's low of 123.08, put in a low of 123.05, so not that much further of a lower low, but we certainly got that out of the way. And they are defending this 4% mark on the yield as well. You actually have a little tiny gap to be aware of there if keeping an eye on the yield. But outside of that, here with the bonds, took out the previous day's low. Now you're coming back up above it. But check out the 120-minute display. That's kind of what I'm keeping an eye on here, or latching onto, with 1, 2, 3 even. Nice easy number there as being the bottom of this previous prolonged range that we've been putting in there with those 30 years. So with that said, without further ado, we'll dial it back here, let some of these charts develop. I'll have Captain on here in about another 30 minutes, and as we can see, certainly a day where market profile will be very interesting for a good portion of these markets. And then this 8:30 figure here is just the FOMC member Barkin speaking, so it's not a data point there, it's a speech of some sort. So we'll let that all start to pan out, keep our eyes on the field, and see what we got lining up for our second full trading day of the new year here.